Welcome into episode 352 of the Skate Podcast. I am Brian DeFelice, joined by Scott McLaughlin. Bridget has, I believe, broadcasting duties today. Of course, with her luck, Scott, it's the day that all the news breaks regarding Jeremy Swayman. So let's get right into it. The Bruins and Swayman agree, finally, to an 8-year, $66 million contract where his annual value is $8.25 million. Scott, if you ask my opinion quickly, the team probably paid a little bit more than they hoped. The player probably got a little bit less than he thought he deserved. And that's a sign of a good deal where both parties have to compromise. The fans are happy. Let's get this show on the road.
Yeah, and they end up a whole $250,000 a year off of what I said made sense at the end of the season back in May. Amazing that it took 5 months to get to this point, but at least they finally got there, and they did it before opening night, 2 days before. Swayman, it sounds like, will not be ready to start opening night, but I think the Bruins expect him to be game ready pretty quickly here early in the season. Jonas Korpisalo will start opening night. We'll get into the roster ramifications and whatnot, but yeah, obviously the biggest story is just that it got done after a whole week of, Cam Neely's comments on Monday and Swayman's agent, Louis Gross, responding that night, and take a few days to decide what they want to do next. And, I think we said this on our last episode. It was like, despite all of that, there's reports out there that they're not that far apart. And it's like, all right, cooler heads have to prevail, right? And like, everyone kind of sits down and figures out that, okay, we can actually bridge this gap and get this done. And they finally did, right? Like, Bruins came all the way up to 8. That was what Cam Neely said. There were reports that Swayman and his agent finally got below asking for 9 at some point. And so, yeah, you end up somewhere in between 8.25. Like you said, probably a little more than the Bruins would have hoped and less than Swayman would have wanted, but that's the name of the game. So both sides probably, I still think probably too stubborn along the way, but not stubborn enough to let this bleed into the regular season and start, costing Swayman money or hurting the Bruins cap or any of the other stuff, or just hurting the team, which is what could have happened. So
yeah, the final number that they agreed to, really, you see it, and your thought is, why did it take so long if this is what it was? Because it makes a lot of sense. I know that we talked about comps. You talked about comps in the past to Swayman's situation with previous goaltenders, and 7, 8 offered by the Bruins, 8 offered by the Bruins, all would have been more than what Swayman's comps would have been in the past. Obviously, you nor I will sit here and say 8.25 is that's fair too. Like, you have to pay for one of the best goalies in the world for sure. But even as recent as yesterday morning, Scott, David Pagnotta, if that's how you say his name, he was reporting that that Swayman's camp had come down into the 8s, but the high 8s, and we all know the Bruins were at 8. And so even as recent as 20, 30 hours ago, they could have been as far apart as close to $1 million. And I mentioned online, I said, look, the player needs to come down still. Like, if somebody has to move here, it's the player. And it's funny because you'll mention the Bruins' initial offer of 6.25 and Swayman's initial ask of 9.5, and the Bruins had moved up almost $2 million from their initial offer, and Swayman's camp moved down like $500 to $700K from theirs. And most people understand where I'm going with that, which is the final number is closer to the team's latest offer than the player's recent ask. And everybody will go online and say, oh, that's not how it works. The Bruins could have offered this. It's like, guys, look, I'm not interested in playing the could have, should have, would have game. Like, I'm just going off of reported offers that were out there. And the fact of the matter is, I never thought that the Bruins were going to pay Swayman 8.5 plus. I always thought it was going to be probably low 8s. And if that's the case, and the player was at high 8s and the Bruins were at 8, something had to give, and it was the player. And it makes all the sense in the world. You just kind of wonder, I don't know, did it have to take them a day before open? I'm glad it happened, obviously, but did it have to take them a day before the roster cut down? Because now, Swayman has to get caught up to speed, and I would like to see him in the net Tuesday night against Florida. I know it's not realistic, but if I had to pick my guy, I'd rather it be Swayman. But he doesn't have the reps in training camp to get tossed into the fire just yet, and that's unfortunate.
Right, and Swayman, I already had one person tweet at me like, so he's held out of all camp and now he's not ready to go, and it's like, well, no, he's been working out, he's been on the ice. He said he was over at BU. I was happy to hear him say now considers himself an honorary Terrier, even though he's the main Black Bear. So yeah, like he's been on the ice, he's been working out, he's been practicing, he's been facing shots. But that's very different than NHL practice, games, NHL shots. Like that, they're going to have one practice down in Florida on Monday. That's just not enough. Like any other game after that, maybe he gets 2 or 3 practices in by Thursday, by the home opener, or, it might take a game or 2 longer than that. Like we'll see, but he'll be ready pretty quickly here. It's not going to take a long ramp up time. It's just too quick of a turnaround for Tuesday night.
Right. Now, as it pertains to the rest of the season, because I don't know about you, Scott, and maybe we'll have to discuss it a little bit when Bridget gets back on tomorrow's episode, which will be more about season previews and stuff. But now I'm just kind of like, now can we just be done? We can just be done talking about the Jeremy Swayman contract stuff. I mean, we can still break down all, how it all played out, but I'm not interested anymore. Now that it's done, it's like, okay, thank God. And what I can say is, looking forward beyond the first week of the season, it's stating the obvious. The Bruins ceiling is back on, right? If they had to play the year, I was trying to be glass half full, because the reality could have been they were without Swayman for half the year or more. And in those situations, you try to see, okay, how can they do without him? And I still think their roster outside of the goal is good enough to make the playoffs and see what happens. But there's obviously no question right now there, in my opinion, the Bruins ceiling is undoubtedly a Stanley Cup. Obviously, I think they're one of probably 6 or 7 teams that very well could be saying the same thing right now. And then we'll see how the season plays out. And there could be some dark horses right now that end up having a great year and they're cup contenders. But it just feels so much better now that he's back in net. And we all wanted this all along. I think any negativity towards the topic, at least from my perspective, was because I just know how important the player is. And I knew that, certainly the later reports of what the Bruins offered was fair for him. And as it turns out, he signs a week later. So the history books will look back and say it wasn't that long of a sweat out period once Neely went public. You just wonder, why wasn't that stuff said behind the scenes?
Yeah, and I'm sure it was. As we know, Cam Neely can be a little bit of a hothead and just says what's on his mind. And obviously, that was the topic of the press conference this Sunday. So Jeremy Swayman and Don Sweeney both met with the media. I was over there at Warrior, and both were asked about Neely's comments. And then Louis Gross's response, and how did that affect negotiations? And to both of their credits, they kind of just took the high road. They weren't going to talk about it. What's in the past is in the past. It's part of negotiations, and now we're just focused on the present and the future and in the start of the season. So that's how I would have expected them to answer it. But obviously, we had to ask the questions. And I think you do kind of wonder a little bit of Swayman, right? Because we've heard, how often he's referenced like arbitration, which he was asked about again on Sunday too. He was asked like, last season you referenced your arbitration multiple times and you using that as motivation, right? We learned that in this Amazon series where he talked about even in the playoffs, he's still using that as a motivation. So he was asked, are you gonna use kind of this whole process all summer, these negotiations or Neely's comments or whatever, as motivation the same way? And he just said the Stanley Cup is motivation. Like, he just said that's his motivation. So good answer for now. We'll see if maybe at some point in the season he brings it up out of the blue like he did with arbitration last year, or has he kind of learned that lesson? He's not going to go down that road, even if he is thinking about it. But at least for Sunday, it was kumbaya. Everyone's back on the same page. Passes the past, and they're moving on.
And as it should be. The reality of the situation is now he's a Boston Bruin until 2032. And Scott, I don't believe I mentioned off the top some of the details as it pertains to no movements, but I believe he has a full no move for the first like 70%, and then he has a couple of no trade lists, I think, as the contract gets older.
I think the no move kicks in year 3, if I have it right. So I think it's years. So I think the first 2 years, I think there's no trade protection at all. So like that kind of, if you wanted to look at it, like that kind of covers his RFA years. And then I think full no move kicks in year 3 through 6. Then it goes down to like a 10-team trade list and then a 10-team no trade. But there is trade protection. I don't think it's right off the bat. And then, the way it's structured, it's all like people might have seen there's kind of the structure of his salary and signing bonuses. All fans really need to know is the cap hit is $8.5 million, all 8 years. That does not change. That stays the same no matter what he's actually getting paid in terms of cash from year to year.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the actual contract, Scott. The 8.25 AAV you just referenced. And personally, I have zero doubts that contract will look amazing, even better and better and better as the years go on. I think earlier in episodes, if I ever referenced, well, he hasn't played a full slate of games, he was splitting the net with Ullmark, I was not saying that from a perspective of I don't believe he can do it given the opportunity. We were talking about negotiations, and both sides tend to be black and white, right? As you learn in like arbitration. So I was trying to play devil's advocate for the team as well as the player and different things too. But I have no doubt that he will be a top goalie in the league for years to come. The only question is injury, which every player has that question mark. So I don't really like going there because there's nothing you can do about that. So barring injuries, Scott, I think the Bruins will have one of the top goalies in the league, continue to for another almost decade where the Bruins won't have to worry about goaltending. And we are already going on 2+ decades of that. So we are spoiled in Boston as it pertains to goaltending.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch, how his workload does increase and what that ramp up looks like. We talked about this when we had Razor on, a month or a month and a half ago, whenever that was, about how he's probably not going to jump straight from a career high 43 starts to like 60 plus. More likely it's maybe you add 10 to 12 starts to his workload the first year, get him up to like 53, 55. That probably feels about right. Korpisalo starts, around 30 games, maybe slightly less. And then you see how he handles that. Like, all right, if he's still fresh at the end of the year and hopefully can handle every game and what you hope is a long playoff run, okay, then maybe next year you ramp it up a little bit more. But that is going to be interesting to watch because I know with some goalies who play, like I know like there's Winnipeg Jets fans who think that Connor Hellebuck playing 60 plus games has hurt him in the playoffs. Like his playoff numbers have not been nearly as good as his regular season numbers. And there's kind of this sentiment that he wears out late in the season. And it's like, well, why not get a better backup and like start to reduce his workload, right? Like the Bruins did that with Tuukka Rask. He had the big money contract. Everyone knew he was the guy in the playoffs, but they made sure they always had a number 2 that they felt good enough about to handle, 25, 30 starts towards the end of Rask's career, even more than that. So Swayman's young. He's in his prime. I don't think he's going to be going back to a 50-50 split anytime soon, but what that number of starts actually looks like is going to be interesting to monitor this year, next year, going throughout this contract.
Now, is there anything in particular throughout that Amazon series with the Swayman episode that you learned something about him that you didn't previously know?
Not really. It kind of, I mean, like, okay, like we learned he had the list of criticisms from arbitration, but none of it really surprised me in terms of like fitting with his character and some of the other things we had heard him say to that point. So maybe some of the specifics were new, like having it all written out on a list. And he revealed that, one of their knocks on him was he wasn't trustworthy in the playoffs. I don't think we had heard that before. But overall, no, it didn't surprise me that he was still using that arbitration hearing as motivation and like referencing back to it even during the playoffs.
Yeah, I found myself watching and I just kept saying to myself, please figure out a way to get this guy signed. Obviously, look, and throughout this process, you saw a lot of people saying just give him what he wants. He's worth this in the open market, blah, blah, blah. He's one of the best goalies in the world, which he is, all those things. But the difference was it seemed like a lot of individuals just don't understand the differences between a UFA and an RFA. So like he didn't have the luxury of going to the open market, and he had to deal with the Bruins salary cap and which, it's not his job, but to worry about the Bruins cap, but it does make a difference in what his number ends up being. But yeah, I just found myself saying, guys, just figure it out. Cause he is, of course he's amazing, but he's such a gamer. Like you just watch him mic'd up on the ice against Florida and Toronto, and you see all the techniques he does off the ice to keep himself sharp. And it's just, I just love the player. Hated how the negotiations played out, but yeah, I watched that series and I was like, can we please not have this guy miss any regular season time?
Yeah, and it's also understanding the difference between a cap, like a hard cap league, and a no cap or a soft cap league, right? Like you'd even hear, you'd hear people calling to sports radio and be like, why does anyone care what the Jacobs spend? Like they should just stop being cheap. And it's like, it's not about the Jacobs being cheap or not. It's about fitting it into the salary cap and what the Bruins feel they can afford to spend, how much of the cap they feel they can afford to allocate to a goalie or to any one player, or now in this case to, really 3 highly paid players that are up over $8 million a year that I think we would all agree are kind of the tenets of this next era of Bruins hockey, and that's David Pastrnak, Charlie McAvoy, and now Jeremy Swayman, and Elias Lindholm as well, like to a slightly lesser extent, but as a new guy coming in, making over $7 million. So, yeah, like, yes, you want good players. Yes, you have to spend to have good players, but there's also that flip side where you risk becoming the Toronto Maple Leafs, where you have too much money tied up at the top of your roster, and every year you're lacking depth, it seems like. So that's the balance. It's not, look, in baseball or football, like, yeah, I'm totally with the player friendly portion of fans who says, yeah, like the owner should just spend to keep good players. Though, baseball has no cap. There's like a luxury tax or whatever. Football has fake salary cap that you can always find ways to move money around if you need to. NBA, every, I don't know what, like top 25 player gets a max contract. So that's its own thing. Hockey is kind of the one league that has a real hard salary cap that, there's a couple ways you can get around it, like long-term IR or, an over 35 contract that's bonus heavy. But like, for the most part, no, like the salary cap's 88 million, you have 88 million and that's kind of it. So You have to figure out how to make the pieces fit. And that was like, I don't think at any point this was about how much money Jeremy and Charlie Jacobs were willing to give Jeremy Swayman. I think it was always about what the front office thought, what thought they could afford to pay him.
Right. And last night, up until last night, and Puckpedia, which took the place of Cap Friendly, actually responded to me last night online because I mentioned that they listed the Bruins as having cap space availability of like 7.8 million or something like that. Obviously, we all knew the Bruins had already offered Swayman 8, and this was only going to go up from there or around 8. But there's only so many cap calculators online you can really see, and Puckpedia at this stage is probably the most the number one in the game, and they were saying the Bruins had 7-8, and they actually responded to me and mentioned that number included having 3 goalies on the roster, being Korpisalo, Bussy, and Patera. He said they could waive and send down Bussy and Patera and gain 1.55 million in cap space. So obviously, like that would have freed up Boston to sign Swayman for even more. But it just goes to show, like, give him 10, give him 11. Like, that's not, you don't just give a guy when you don't give an RFA. You can't afford it. And that's why something had to give. Like, the Bruins could only go up so high is the point here. And both sides, they came to an agreement, and it's all great. And by the way, this agreement, I don't view it as I said off the top, the team went higher than they wanted. The player took less than he wanted. Good compromise. That being said, I'm not looking at Swayman signing for 825 saying he took a hometown discount. Like, I think he did really well in this. I think, like, good in the player. He got 66 million reasons now, as Cam Neely would say, to take care of himself and future generations. So
yeah, and as I laid out on a previous episode, like, he did push what's possible for a restricted free agent. This is now the second largest contract behind only Andrei Vasilevsky that a restricted free agent has ever signed. Restricted free agent goalie, I should specify. He's now tied with Ilya Sorokin as the 5th highest paid goalie in the league. And if you take out Carey Price, who's retired for all intents and purposes, tied for 4th highest. Also tied with Sorokin for 5th biggest contract a goalie has ever gotten in terms of total money. So, to do all that as an RFA, like, that's significant, right? He matched. Sorokin was a year out from unrestricted free agency and arguably has, a more solidified resume at the time that he signed. He certainly had more experience. I think both of those goalies both Swayman and Sorokin are really good. So if you're forcing me to pick one, I mean, I guess Swayman because of his age, because he's a few years younger. But, like, that's impressive. He topped what UC Saros got as a pending unrestricted free agent. He took $7.74 million a year. So Swayman has now made it so that, in theory, a restricted free agent can get paid what just a year ago or even a few months ago unrestricted free agents were getting paid. Now, I think Igor Shesterkin's going to really kind of blow the goalie market out of the water. Like, I think he's going to push it even higher. He'll probably pass Carey Price as the highest paid goalie ever whenever his deal gets done. But Swayman, he did help do his part to up the goalie market because it had kind of stagnated in recent years where no one was really going above 8.25 or 8.5 for pretty much anyone.
So based off what you've seen in preseason so far with Joonas Korpisalo, what would you feel comfortable with him playing this year for a game total as a backup to Swayman?
I think like 28 to 30 makes sense. Like, obviously it's not going to be an even split. So at that point, I think really whatever number it ends up at is fine. Like, I think Korpisalo is perfectly solid in a platoon or a backup situation. if he can play the way he played for most of this preseason. Now, he did end the preseason with kind of a dud Thursday night in Quebec City. Not that all those goals were his fault. Team really stunk ahead of him. But yeah, I think you're looking at that range, like 25 to 30, high 20s, whatever, somewhere around there. You know, the big problem with him in Ottawa was not only was it a bad situation, not only was his play poor, but I also think having to go out there every night and trying to be an everyday goalie, something he had never been before, I don't think that helped him at all.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think as a true backup, I don't think anybody should have any issues with Korpisalo. I think obviously what the reality was up until this morning definitely was enough to have people a little bit nervous, but in the role that he will now be playing in, and also just Bussy. Like, I don't think Bussy really showed a ton throughout preseason to show he could be a NHL backup at this point either. So that might be unfair, might be too small of a sample size, but can only go off of what we've seen. So, Scott, I don't know if you have any lingering takes from these contracts negotiations before we head into just one other thing I wanted to ask about, which would be final roster predictions prior to Monday.
So I think this will tie together a bit, but I was just going to note, so we're recording just after 2 p.m. Sunday, and the Bruins did already place Brandon Bussy and Jiri Patera on waivers. I thought maybe they might keep one of them around if they didn't think Swayman would be ready to even back up for opening night, but that kind of indicates to me that they feel like he's at least ready to back up and probably start a game, one of the first 3 to 4 games. It's not like this is going to be, 4 or 5 straight starts for Korpisalo where you have to wonder, would Bussy or Patera get a start? Like, no, they're just waiving them. Obviously, I think Bussy in particular, they're going to hope that he clears and they have him in Providence again. He did finish the preseason strong, his last 2 games, including Saturday night down in Washington. But yeah, so we'll see what happens there. Puckpedia now so they also waived Patrick Brown, Jeffrey VL, and Billy Sweezy. So they're down to, I believe, 21 players Puckpedia has them at, but that includes, so like their camp roster is still higher than that, so they still have more cuts to make rather. But guys on like NHL deals,
hopefully they have more cups to make, Scott.
Yes, many more. Eight in a row. The entire Swayman contract. Yeah, so Puckpedia has them at 21 players, $1.9 million in cap space. But so some of that could be used to sign Tyler Johnson or keep around, a Cole Koepke or Riley Tufte, or maybe both, because those guys are still here as of now.
Yeah, exactly. I noticed Koepke wasn't one of the forwards that the Bruins placed on waivers. Obviously, I think you mentioned last episode, Scott, it's not very common for players to get claimed off waivers the 24 hours leading up to the roster cutdowns, because people are trying to get their cap situation in order. So I feel like the Bruins are putting guys on waivers knowing they'll clear and go to Providence or whatever. But it seems like they want to even take that chance maybe with Koepke, to your point. Tyler Johnson is another one. Yeah, just under $2 million in cap space. So seems like, I don't know what he would really get. Could you get Johnson for closer to $1 million than $2 million? I don't really know what his value is at this point, but in any event, what would you say this means for some final roster predictions, personnel wise, Scott?
Yeah, so I should also note Ian Mitchell remains. So I believe there's 3 players left that I would have thought were in consideration to be waived that were not waived on Sunday, and that's Koepke, Tufte, and Ian Mitchell, which I think means those guys are basically on the roster through the 5 p.m. deadline, because I think someone has to clear waivers before that deadline. So you're not putting them on waivers. Like, you can't put them on waivers Monday afternoon and then they clear by 5 p.m. So I guess what that tells me is maybe like Patras starting on injured reserve, which, could be as short as like a 7-day thing. So I think still a couple moves to make, but I feel like the Bruins are probably pretty close to set here and might have some guys around that, maybe don't make it through the first week, but are there for now just as extra bodies, have in practice, have on the trip down to Florida. And yeah, and now, maybe the biggest question left is what happens with Tyler Johnson? Do they sign him? Do they let him go? Do they sign him by opening night? Or is it a little bit like a Heinen situation where he hangs around a little bit after that? Yeah, that's kind of where my mind goes.
How do you feel the team feels right now about the fact that Fabian Lysell and Georgi Merkulov, to a lesser extent, didn't have the camps to make the Bruins make tough calls on them? They both got kind of a garbage time preseason game at the end there. I know Monty said after the game, like, we still have guys trying to make the team. I don't think they were even in a position heading into the Washington game to make the team. But Georgi Merkulov, to me, Scott, doesn't, and I really don't mean to cut a player down at the knees and say what they can or can't do in their profession. Georgi Merkulov could end up becoming an NHLer one day, whether it's Boston or somewhere else. I just don't really, at this moment in time, see it, because his size and lack of NHL's speed, escapability to make the plays he makes in the minors at the NHL level. He hasn't shown he can do it. He's a finisher down in the minors. He hasn't finished in the NHL in many preseason games or the few regular season games he got. And then, yeah, his size he just seems to be on the ice too much. And then Lysell, just outside of that middle week of camp, didn't make much of an impression either. So if you're the Bruins, how are you viewing, let's start with Lysell, because he was a first round pick for them, not last year, 3 years ago. And at this point, he's 21 years old, turning 22 during the season at some point. And you got players that are 18, 19, 20, and early 21 that are probably in the NHL at this point. It's not common, but it happens. So how does the team feel after training camp, knowing that these guys didn't really make much of a push again?
I think you feel like they better go down to Providence with the right attitude and try to force your hand from there. They should both be right on the doorstep. And I think despite some quiet preseason games, I still think they are. I think you saw flashes of it in the preseason, but certainly not on any sort of consistent enough basis. Lysell especially strung together like a week of good games and practices, but that's not enough when you're talking about 2.5 or 3 weeks of training camp. Merkulov was a little more hit or miss, but I thought had good stretches within the games that he did play. But yeah, I guess what's most disappointing is that, they did kind of go so quietly at the end, where these last 2 preseason games, the Bruins overall just laid 2 stinkers. And it's like, I heard veterans getting asked, like, do you think you were just kind of looking ahead to the regular season? And it's like, veterans might do that and they can get away with it because they're going to be on the team. But like, if you're a kid getting thrown, even whether you think you have a real shot or not, whether you think that them sending you down last week was already kind of a sign that you're not going to be there, like, you have to treat that as if you still have a chance. And, Fabian Lysell said that when we talked to him on, what was that, Wednesday or Thursday, before, just when he got called back up. Like, he said, I have to make it a hard decision for them. But then the way he played, it's like you almost wonder if he even really believed that. Like, did he believe the words coming out of his own mouth, or had he already kind of accepted defeat? Because I would say, like, that's, if any part of you had already done that, that's just a totally wrong approach. Like, maybe Fabian Lysell had no chance of making it no matter what. But if he went out and had the 2 final preseason games played like he did in that Tuesday game, a week ago, like at least he would have given them something to think about. Instead, it's like he probably only confirmed their suspicions, where it's like, yeah, all right, he isn't giving us that effort consistently. He needs more time in Providence.
Yeah, and I should mention, while we're recording here at 3:00 on Sunday, Ty Anderson tweeted out 10 minutes ago, Scott, the updated camp roster. And maybe you have or haven't seen it yet. It's probably in your email. But Georgi Merkulov's name is crossed out, but Fabian Lysell's name is still not crossed out. So I'm not sure if that's just like they're waiting until last minute tomorrow. I just should mention, technically, as this recording, I think he's technically still in camp and not sent down. We're just speculating on what we think is going to happen.
Yeah, so because those guys don't require waivers, the guys who require waivers, we know because the waiver list comes out every day at 2 p.m. So whether the Bruins officially announce anything or not, we know who's on waivers. Usually they're a little delayed in terms of like officially announcing their roster moves. So I would imagine we're going to get a press release in, sometime Sunday afternoon, or they might just wait till Monday. But either way, as we're recording at 3 p.m., they're on a plane down to Florida. So my guess is Fabian Lysell's probably not on the flight, but maybe he is. Maybe they're going to keep him around for a Monday practice. Like I don't know.
Yeah, because I only asked because I feel like, and again, I'm not sure when that got emailed to Ty and Scott. I know you're on the.
I don't. It's not. Well. It's not an email. I think Ty just has the running list that he's crossing off.
Oh, that's not an official list then.
No.
Oh, okay, I thought that may have been something that the team emails to the media.
No.
Okay, then I rescind it, because I was gonna say I'm wondering why Merkulov at this time would have been crossed out and not the two of them together. But okay, so maybe it was an unofficial list. I take that back. Okay, so we can probably maybe reserve the most of the chatter for tomorrow, Scott. We're gonna have individual predictions and season predictions for the teams tomorrow with Bridget. We had to get this out today because of obviously the breaking news. Didn't want to leave people hanging on the Swayman stuff. And honestly, I think tomorrow is better to. I don't want to focus on the Swayman stuff anymore after today. Now it'll be in the rearview mirror, and of course, he will affect some predictions we will have going forward. But as far as the contract stuff, that's going to be buried right here and now today. But barring any final thoughts from Scott on the situation.
No, I think I'm good. But yeah, I mean, it obviously definitely ties into season predictions, because what my prediction for this team would be with Swayman versus still having this lingering uncertainty, like it definitely changes it a lot. I said it before, so like I'm not going to spoil anything, but just in generalities, I think they're a cup contender with Swayman. But had this lingered, had there been uncertainty of like, is he going to play this year? I think you're looking at a fringe playoff team. Like because I think having a great goalie versus having replacement level goalies, like, or possibly even worse, just makes such a huge difference. Like, again, just ask the New Jersey Devils last year. Like, that was not a bad team, but they had some of the worst goaltending in the league, and it totally sunk them. They missed the playoffs.
Yeah. It's funny. Last episode, you had to jump for the last 15, 20 minutes, but I was talking to Bridget, and I put out a survey, and I went back the last 10 years of Stanley Cup champions, and half of them, their starting goaltender didn't even receive Vezina votes the year that they won the cup. So I was just trying to pose the question to Bruins Nation, like, if Swayman doesn't play for the Bruins this year, worst case scenario, right? Which I never really thought that was going to be the case. I did think he could have gone to December, but I didn't think he was going to hold out the whole year. But basically, the sentiment was, in the last decade, half the teams to win the cup didn't have a top goalie in the league or a Vezina goalie that year. So would the Bruins still be contenders without Swayman? Could they be contenders? Is the rest of their roster good enough? And I forget the exact results, Scott, but it was it was something like high 50s of voters said that they would still contend, and low 40s said that they would no longer be contenders. Not necessarily not a playoff team, but they wouldn't be contenders. Obviously, you would fall in the 43% or so based on your comments. The good news is we don't even have to worry about that anymore, and that's fucking amazing. So here we go. Now it's like, all off season, my biggest concern was like, who are they going to get at the trade deadline for the second line, right? And then that all of a sudden didn't seem so important when we were talking about, is Swayman not going to be there? And now that he's back, it's like, okay, they have a very manageable need that they can fill at the deadline in about 5 months, whatever it is. So once they do that, I anticipate this Bruins team having a roster that's, just as competitive as any come springtime.
Yeah, that they should. They're certainly built. I think built better for the playoffs. I think that was a big part of their offseason. I'm sure one of the things we'll get into on the preview is just how worried we are about the offense. Like, at the risk of overreacting to preseason action, they did have trouble scoring this preseason, including when they had regulars out there. But and that's gonna be a question for a while, because we know that's kind of the sacrifice they made, right? Like, they are a top 6 winger short. So, but we'll get into all that more. I think we're recording like later Monday, so we'll probably be dropping that either Monday night, Tuesday morning, but that'll be there for people ahead of Tuesday season opener.
It'll be a game day listen. I would just call it a game day listen by the time we get done with it. So you can wake up Tuesday morning.
Yeah, it'll be timely beyond the first game though. Like, it's gonna be it's gonna be more big picture thoughts. We're not just previewing one game here.
No, of course not. No, honestly, it's probably less about the first game than anything. I don't.
Unless the Bruins lose 8-0, then I take it all back. They stink.
Yeah. Well, you know what though? I will say, last time the Bruins opened the season on the road,
that's true. Yeah, they did get crushed
and got blown out. They went to the Stanley Cup Finals, and for those who don't know what I'm talking about, I believe it was. Well, I know it was the 18-19 season, but they lost to the Capitals. I want to say 6-0. In what? Actually, it was Washington's banner raising night.
Yeah, it was.
So life's a simulation, Scott. We're just drawing parallels. So just book the Bruins to the Cup Finals this year, right now, based on that logic. So definitely not flawed at all. Okay, so thank you all for listening. Scott, do you have any more comments?
Nope, all good.
All right, thanks all for listening. Please breathe the biggest sigh of relief that you've all been waiting to let go of. And hockey season starts tomorrow, and we can't wait to cover it all year for you guys. So have a great rest of your Sunday, and we'll talk to you Tuesday morning. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.